James, I'm coming! I will!
I can't even check the UV. Really not that
No, put your sunglasses on! Yeah!
Morning. Madrid next month. Right, you know what? I guess I
Hey.
That's exactly what I
You can't grip properly. No, you can't. Oh no, I don't use it a lot. So I didn't get my notice of January.
Hiya.
British hard pounders. Should we just do them?
Yes, two of them.
It's a nice course, I really like.
I like what you can't.
I know, Mark, about 40 grip down.
Do you want to sit this side, look?
Sorry, I literally pushed it as I was going to look at it. Thank you for Jonathan, that one. Thank you.